Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Cho. I'm the Head of External Affairs for AmCham Singapore. Thank you for joining this Asian American Pacific Islanders Month session, Stop Asian Hate, Reducing Conflict, Increasing Empathy. I am also your moderator for this session. I wanted to briefly share a little on the background of why AmCham decided to organize this event. It was partially on personal reasons, as both AmCham CEO Shen Chun-Lei and I are Asian Americans. And the surge of anti-Asian hate and violence have impacted us and our friends and family back home in the US. But largely, as a chamber, we also did not want to shy away from talking about a critical issue impacting not only the US, but also those in the APAC region. Media coverage of the ongoing incidences of violence against the Asian community has understandably given many people concern on living in the US. However, the US still remains a key destination for those seeking education and work opportunities. Many companies send employees on international postings to give them the experience and exposure necessary for future promotions. Like many chambers in this region, AmCham would love to see more Asian business leaders in global roles, and international experience, including experience in the US, is a critical component to getting those roles. So we strongly welcome a flow of Asian business leaders to the US. The benefits of living and working in the US is not a one-way street. The US also benefits. The US benefits from having people of different cultures and backgrounds live in the US and share their own unique experiences with the local community. Often racism comes from ignorance, and an effective way to dispel ignorance is to create opportunities for awareness and empathy. Which brings us to the panel today. I'm really grateful that our business leaders, Billie, Bert, and Tony, have agreed to share their experiences and insights on living and working in the US. I encourage you to ask questions and hope you walk away with useful knowledge that will make your future move to the US an easier experience. We'll start this session with self-introductions by each of our speakers, and then we'll dive straight into Q&A. So for our attendees, please don't be shy. You can channel your questions into the Q&A box, and I'll be sure to spread them to our panel themselves. Just a really quick introduction of yourself. You know, I am the head of external affairs, but I'm also an Asian American. I was born and raised in California, lived there my entire life. And while I have lived in very urban cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, I've actually spent the formative years of my life from age 7 to 17 in a tiny, tiny little town in far Northern California, where I was pretty much the only Asian in town. My high school, middle school were primarily white and Hispanic. So it was quite a transition living in there. And I think it really shaped the person that I am today. So without further ado, I will call on each of our speakers and ask them to give you a brief introductions. Billie, I would like to start with you first.
Hey, thank you. Good morning, good evening, depending on which part of the world you are. Maybe let me start off with my journey with UPS. I've been with UPS since 1996. Over the last 25 years, I have relocated a couple of times with the company. I'm a Malaysian with Singapore PR. My last assignment before moving to Atlanta was living in Singapore for more than 10 years. So of course, 2 years ago, moved to Atlanta with my husband. I started our journey here, and for someone that never lived in Atlanta or in the US before, is an experience. So looking forward for the discussion. Hopefully that we can have a productive and educational session in the next 1 hour. So I'm going to pass it back to probably Bert or Tony to share that, to introduce themselves.
Sure, Bert, if you could share a bit about yourself.
Yes, thanks, Jenica. Thanks, Billie. Good morning and good evening. I'm Bert Park. I lead the Dell Technologies product group that's based in Singapore. And we have one of the unique setups that the business I lead is the global software and peripherals business, but it's based out of Singapore. So I'm here together with Jessica for this webinar from Singapore. I appreciate this opportunity to come together with all of you today. So about my background, I was actually born in Seoul, Korea, and immigrated to the US when I was 14 years old. So I went to high school and university and my graduate school all in the US, mostly in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. I have a unique background in such that now I have lived and worked in 4 countries since my graduation. So I lived and worked in US, I lived and worked in Korea and Japan, and now in Singapore. So I have a pretty Asia and US based experience that kind of shapes who I am. And I kind of tend to look at things more from a global type of perspective rather than a national type of a perspective, because I haven't really lived as an adult more than 10 years in any one country. So glad to join this session and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Bert. And last but not least, Tony, if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, so Bert, you and I actually have very similar backgrounds. I didn't realize that. I was not born in Korea, but I actually have spent a fair amount of time overseas as well. I lived in Malaysia for 2 years up in KL. I was down in New Zealand for 2 years and over in Australia for 2 years. But okay, so I'm Tony Jace. I've been at the Crisis Prevention Institute for 12 years. The Institute has been around for 42 years. And I'm proud to announce that we were founded by an AAPI individual. So that's a really unique, storied history of CPI that we're really proud about, especially this month of May. Here in the US, we are celebrating AAPI month. So the Crisis Prevention Institute, we do 2 things, and we do 2 things very well. And we've been doing it for 42 years. The first thing we do is we train professionals how to handle life's daily crisis moments. So a crisis moment for our customers may be a schizophrenic is becoming very anxious in a emergency room, or it could be a child with autism is starting to act out in a classroom and starting to become violent. So we train professionals how to de-escalate that situation, and in those rare instances where some type of intervention is required, how to do that in a safe and nonviolent manner. So that's one side of the business. The other side of the business that we don't have to talk about too much today is we train professionals how to keep our parents and loved ones who are living with dementia at their best abilities as long as possible. So we train therapists how to interact with them. It's a very therapeutic type interaction type like model that we deliver to that group. And again, it's really to make sure through person-centered care and through very personal, direct activities that we can keep our seniors that are living with dementia as capable and as able as possible as they live with dementia. So those are the 2 things we do. I started my career with Kimberly-Clark Corporation. It's a large consumer products company. Then I joined Ernst & Young in management consulting. And that's when I spent the 6 years over in your lovely area, which I love, and we would love to get back. And then I spent another, so that was 10 years in total at E&Y. I spent 6 years at Oracle, just a large high-tech company. And then, like I said, the past 12 years here in Wisconsin at Crisis Prevention. So looking forward to the discussion tonight.
Thank you so much, Tony. And I really wanted to sort of kick off the discussion first on media. And I know that, the reason why we're here today, and for many of us, is that we have been seeing this increase in media coverage on anti-Asian hate and violence. And, for some, they may say this is just the media trying to, get those clickbait titles. And then for those living in the US, there has been a surge. And, I'd like to start with Bert, because Bert, you've grown and lived in the US for quite a long period of time. It'd be great to sort of get that background context point of view. How was it living during those different periods? What were your experiences? And then, looking back now, what do you think would have helped you prepare for living in the US, not only during those times, but even now during this time?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, Jessica. I think at first I want to kind of recognize that it is a very difficult time for Asian Americans, especially in the US and perhaps even globally, if you're not in Asia. So it's on a human level, it is very hard to process these racism and even the acts of violence against the Asian community. It's definitely unacceptable, but some of this is also far too familiar. So it's in times like this that we need to remember what makes us strong. And reflecting on my own experience and growing up in latter part of my childhood, and also going to schools in US, I think, first when I went to US, since I immigrated there with my parents, I accepted the fact that I was living in a foreign country as a foreigner. So when people kind of looked at you as a foreigner, it didn't make me, feel that it was a racism or anything like that because I was a foreigner living in a foreign country. But then later I begin to understand more about the Asian American immigration history and why some of the stereotypes existed based on some of these histories, kind of help understand the context of the issue. So I don't, it's like many of you already know this, but Asian immigration started back in the 19th century, more like in the second half of 19th century to US. First with Chinese working in West Coast railroad projects, and then Japanese and Koreans going into Hawaiian plantations. And then I think there was a little bit of a break. And after Second World War, there was also a large surge in immigration from various countries from the Asia. And also there was students who came to the US and have studied in the US, and they stayed on in US, working in the US, and rooted their families there. So like these days you hear things about, Asian Americans are, in a better economic situation than other minorities. But I think if you look at details of the data, you'll also find that that's not so true. While there's large population of Asian Americans that are professionals, there's also a significant number that are not, and then significant number of Asian Americans also fall in the lower income class group. So I think these stereotypes, you'll run into some racial biases and even discrimination, and lately even act of violence, is going to be what you'll either directly or indirectly experience. And I think your experiences will also be very different on where you will end up going, because US is a large country with many states and many regions. So typically the West Coast and the Northeast part of the country has large mix of Asian community, whereas perhaps the South still has a much less number. So I think your actual experience will be, quite different depending on where you'll be going, and also, what type of work or school that you'll be actually going to.
Great, thanks so much, Bert, for that. And I think it's interesting to see how much the US has changed. I think maybe 15, 20 years ago, especially when I was in elementary school, it's not much was known. There wasn't much, I think, known about the Asian community. But now, you look particularly in, the West Coast and California, sometimes you hear K-pop on their general radio. You'll see a lot of really great ethnic restaurants coming up. And that's in urban cities, but what is it still the same in sort of the more rural areas? And Bert, you brought up a really great point. Your experiences will definitely vary depending on where you are in the US. So, I think this is a great segue to Billie. I would love to hear from Billie, who, moved to the US quite recently, I think over 2 years ago. What was that process like? How did UPS prepare you for your move?
Thanks for the question. Like I said, like I mentioned earlier, I've relocated with UPS a couple of times, and I remember my first relocation from Malaysia to Hong Kong was 16 years ago, and there was a mobility consultant in my Petaling Jaya home interviewing me and my husband at that time, ensuring that we were ensuring that we know what we were getting ourselves into, right? Also highlighting the potential differences on culture and lifestyle, and if we were both ready to move at that time. So of course, all that with the intention to make sure that both employer and employee are successful coming out of the international assignment. So it was a very comprehensive process, I would say, including helping my family finding our new home, getting the girls, I have two daughters, very, very young at that time, into their school, where to shop for groceries and which wet market is better. So of course, we went through a similar process 2 years ago to move to Atlanta. The only difference is the process was a lot simpler because the girls decided to stay back in Singapore. So like I said, for someone like me, never lived in the US before, that whole process and experience was invaluable, at least for the first 9 months until global pandemic. I would say that I don't think there are any mobility companies or employer knew that they needed to prepare their employees for a global pandemic in a foreign country and living in the middle of social unrest and racism all at the same time. But I have to say this, I think that whole the orientation process does prepare me very, very well, but there's still a lot of areas that we need to start thinking as to what we can incorporate into to prepare for this unprecedented time.
Great, Billie, and sort of, expanding on that, do you have any sort of thoughts on what it should now include? Bert mentioned, getting a better understanding of, the history of where you are moving. Would you say that maybe even history lessons should start to be included within that transitional process? Within your 2 years experience, especially in this pandemic, what do you think are some things that HR folks should sort of keep an eye on?
Well, I in my mind, two things came out that pop up immediately. So we all know overseas relocation itself is stressful, right? Coupled with what's going on right now, I would say a support ecosystem that check on employee and their family regularly is important. It can be through forums or just a simple Zoom call. Now, often employer focus on their employee, but I think we got to be mindful that if their family members are feeling unsafe, the assignment will not be successful. I also agree with what Bert just mentioned, that having a platform that will continue to train and bring awareness to any situational changes is important, be it whether at school or within their communities. I give you one example. In the last 2 months, I personally attended no less than 5 webinar sessions organized by various UPS employee group. We have different business resource group within UPS on Asian hate crime awareness, Asian American and Pacific Islander history. Bert just touched on a little bit. The do and don'ts as a bystander, if you are witnessing an assault or harassment, and what tactics to deploy. So those educations and tactics are critical so that people could readily put themselves to use when they feel that they need to. So now I will pass it to Tony. He's the expert and he'll be able to tell you a little bit more of what I mean by that. But I personally benefited a lot by just attending and get myself educated.
Great, thanks so much for that. And this is a great segue as well to Tony. You were with CPI. I'm sure you've been tracking a lot of the data and talking to your customers. What have you been seeing in terms of incidences of anti-Asian hate? And this ties in with one of the questions that an attendee has asked. For those in the US, what are these sentiments of being Asian? And in America, when these surge, this rise of violence has started?
Yeah, so there's a lot there, a couple of questions to touch on. So a few things around that. First is, Bert said it well, it's so beautiful to have, we do gain as a nation when we have other people from other countries come here. And we also learn a lot when we go to any of the Asia Pac countries and learn there and bring it back. So, and I also agree with Bert in the sense that, it really, you can't just look at the US, just like we can't look at Asia as one block. You can't look at the US as one block of states where everything is the same. It is very different on the coasts, and then even rural versus suburban versus urban. But our customers and ourselves, we've been tracking hate crimes for quite a while, and I mean it is one of the gaps in the U.S. is that we don't have a very good national database for any type of hate crime, be it anti-Semitism, which we're seeing now, right, as a result of the conflict over in Gaza and Israel. the hate crimes against Jews is off the charts now as well here in the U.S., as well as the Asian hate crimes, and that is so a couple of things are driving sort of that awareness that we have now. One is that the media is really picking up on it, and it is a concern. The second is just the pandemic, right? And sort of the nuances that, where it originated or where it really came out of and things like that. And politics and media have not helped sort of damper sort of the fear and anxiety that goes along with hearing about this. And it's really ramped up, not just the fear and anxiety in any Asians that are living in the US, but also some of the people that are not as informed or not as aware of their both conscious and unconscious bias. So there has been an increase, and thankfully, I mean, just a couple of days ago, the federal government did take note and did pass in a bipartisan manner, so really Republicans and Democrats, the anti-Asian hate crime bill to knock down those occurrences. So, I mean, it's a very positive thing, and a lot of it is what Bert and Billie were talking about in terms of just pure knowledge, pure history. And what I like most, and Billie touched on this a little bit, is that you need to humanize these interactions. And that's what CPI teaches is how to humanize every action you have so that you break away a lot of these groupings that we sort of fall into ourselves, right? Be it ethnicity or socioeconomic. I mean, Bert was right. Out of the working poor right now in the US, Asians there's more working poor of Asian than there is the population percentage of Asians. So a lot of these sort of old tropes that are out there can easily be knocked down with facts and data. It's just that we have a lot of work to do there. So yeah, that's my. But we are absolutely seeing a surge. We are reporting on it more now than ever. We're tracking it, thankfully, at the governmental level, and that will sort of take some of the heat off and give us some facts and data that we can work from.
Thanks so much, Tony. And, just to answer a little bit of Jennifer's question in terms of, being an Asian in America during this time, during all these media reports, what I am hearing from my friends and colleagues is this really a greater awareness of your surroundings. I think they already, because of the pandemic, they were trying not to go out too much, but now they're limiting themselves even more because they feel that there's just an edge of tension every time they walk outside. They don't know whether someone is eyeing them, if they're going to be a target for some kind of, verbal or even physical assault, is the sense that I get. Billie, I don't know how it's been in Atlanta. I know that things are starting to open up in the US. People are starting to go outside a lot more. How have you been feeling as you've been walking out?
Yeah, and you touch on that. I think if I were to look back my last 2 years, I think I was adjusting my life to the pandemic more than the fact that I'm in the US with the hate crime that we just talked about. And I guess we all had to adjust our lives in the last 1 year, regardless of where we are, right? Now, if I were to reflect back to the pre-pandemic scenario, I would say, like what you just said, I got to relearn my surroundings. There were certain things that I took for granted when I first arrived, such as I forgot I looked different and sounded differently. I went about my business as though that I was in Singapore until I had a 3-hour cultural orientation with a consultant a month into my relocation. As you know, because of me extremely busy with the move, with the new job and all that, kind of push back that orientation session. But I would strongly encourage, if you're going to go into a new country, I think that will be an important session to do it earlier. Now, after that session, I started paying more attention to my surroundings, like what areas and shopping malls to avoid. Definitely not walking on dark streets, and always fill up my gas tank before going to the airport, for example, as to which gas station to avoid. Now, this is not just US, but tips when you are in any unfamiliar cities. Really, you got to do your research, right? Because sometimes we take things for granted, like I said, after living in Singapore for more than 10 years. So I will also say this, even though there are risks, don't let it stop you from enjoying the place and the experience, because that is what the relocation is all about. That's what this is all about. A little bit more research as to the route that you go to work, the route that you take to the school, the area that you choose to stay, to call home with, I think will go a long way.
Thanks so much for that, Billie. And I mean, I fully agree with you. A little knowledge can go a long way, not only to prepare you, but also to give yourself some mental ease of mind. So I think that's really great advice. So we are starting to get a flow of questions from our attendees. So we have one from Marco who asks, are you seeing an exodus of Asian employees based in the US returning to Asia, or more Asian prospects declining positions in the US at your respective companies due to the current racial climate? So this is for all of our speakers.
Well, let me take that. So from a Dell Technologies perspective, I haven't heard any exodus of the Asian professionals working in US wanting to move back or anything like that. So really, I haven't seen that. At a personal level, I see some of my younger colleagues or the younger colleagues, not at Dell, but at large, that maybe I shouldn't consider moving to US now because of what's going on in the US. And I generally give them hey, this racial bias and issues that you hear about is not really something new that just spurred up with a pandemic. It's been around, and US is maybe a bit more open in communication as to how these things are communicated in the press and all that. But I'll take a pretty, perhaps even a not so agreeable position that some of these biases exist everywhere in the world, I think, within any country. So when I was growing up in Korea, there was always people, even in South Korea, there was even incidences where people who are east part of the peninsula versus west part of peninsula kind of talk down at each other. So it's not a racism, but it's a bit of a bias that goes beyond just small talk. So I think some of these things exist everywhere you run into. Now the problem you really face is, how serious is it? Is it really situation where even what you've seen with the George Floyd case, where police force over time are so violent when they're truly handling any Afro-American citizens. That become a serious issue, especially in US. But some of these Asian hate crimes that you see has been around, and I think it's a global issue, not unique to US. I think what's important for us as Asians living in Asia or Asians that are living in US is to how do you prepare yourself so that you are prepared to deal with it. Of course, at a government level, government and the societies has to do a much better job of managing these hate crimes and such, so that this doesn't become social issue. But as an individuals, I think it's better to prepare yourself as to how to deal with it, how to get some support when you're feeling insecure and not safe in any place.
Thanks for that. Billie, Tony, would you like to comment?
Tony, you want to go ahead?
I'll go. I mean, just a couple things. First, we don't hire a lot of Asians into business and so forth. So, but we have not seen anything like that. The one thing I do want to pick up on, though, is what Billie said earlier, and to some degree, Bert. Being an ally and having allies is very important. So that this alliance is a very big part of dealing with this. And what we have, I'll spare everybody the science behind fear and anxiety and bias and things like that. But we all have biases from coming out of the womb, right? From very get-go there's a bias that is always there, and there's a lot of science around why that exists, both conscious and unconscious. However, what we've known and what we've been training for 40 years or 42 years at CPI is that there is almost like a predictable manner in the way that crisis moments unfold. And it typically starts with fear and anxiety. And then sometimes it may move into defensiveness. And then it could end up in an acting out episode. And then finally, there's what we call therapeutic rapport or attention release. And when you're in a fear and anxious state, what happens is that your amygdala takes over your brain and you narrow your focus, and you're not as able to process in an executive sort of reasonable manner what a next step should be or what I should say next or something like that. So this works in two ways. One is if you're the object of whatever it is, let's say a verbal insult or something like that, you have to realize that person is probably in a fear and anxious state to begin with. And they're acting out in a very narrow, sort of emotive way, and they're not thinking reasonably. So any reasonable, interaction won't actually land and do a lot because they're just not in that place. Same with you, right? If you start feeling fear and anxious, there's a couple things you can do to sort of disconnect that and make sure that your executive brain is able to reason and able to respond back. And that's why training is important. Knowledge is important, but training as well. And having allies around or bystanders, like Billie said, is very important because it helps sort of take some of that away and sort of and pushes some comments or some focus elsewhere. But as soon as someone gets in a defensive state, and you can usually tell when they move from anxiety, being anxious to being very defensive and very aggressive, there's only so many things you can do. You have to be very direct, and you need to say something like, listen, did I say something that offends you? You have to be very direct, and it's like a lot of very sort of direct language to approach that, because that's the only way. You need to have very simple, you're asking for very simple answers and trying to get their executive brain back working and out of their sort of fear place. And then, yeah, certainly having allies around it is very important, but there are things that you can do around that. And the most important thing, if there's two things I want you to take away, one is behavior is a form of communication. So even nonverbal, you have to pick up on nonverbal cues, not just verbal, but also nonverbal, the way they stand, the way you're standing, the way you feel, the way you look. All those things sort of what weave in there. So behavior is a form of communication. You need to look for all these forms of communication, how it's progressing. But then also, you also want to make sure that you humanize that moment. You make it very person-centered. And you talk like, Rachel, you grew up in the US. I mean, I went to school in, Northern California, whatever it is. You need to humanize it. You need to break this tension of groups, what they think is going on, and make it just two people. And so those are a few things that you can do. So with that, I hand it over to you, Billie, to maybe answer more questions around Asians not being as willing to work in the US.
Well, I would use myself as an example. I'm still in the US right now. I don't think I'm going home anytime soon unless something pop up. But I can say this. I think over the last 1 year, due to pandemic and travel restrictions, a lot of employers, or I would say executives, realize that there's a new way of working, right? Working from home become a lot more accepted, as well as it's the new normal now. So whether is it still a must, or is it still mandatory for an executive or individual to work out of certain offices or certain location, is now being rethink by a lot of employers. Like I can give you an example, even my workplace, there are executives that is part of the international staff, like what I'm heading up the international sales and solution for the world that based out of corporate office. So there are also some executive that is based in Europe, simply because he's not able to travel to US that often. So this whole thing may change the landscape in the future, not because of the hate crime, but it's probably because of the pandemic and allowing us to find a new way of working from home or working from other locations.
Thank you for that, Billy. And just sort of, going from that, there is a related question. So one of them asks, given the gun violence and Asian hate, some Singaporeans are saying they'd rather go to the UK or Australia. So already, we're starting to see that thought of an exodus. How do we convince them now that the US is a safe place to work and study, that is still a great and important place to get that experience? I mean, this is for each of our speakers.
Yeah, let me just pop in real quick. I mean, this is something that we track quite a bit. So we track workplace violence at a very low level. We're, in fact, as a private company, we generate like the largest study ever of workplace violence in the US. And what we find is so different than what you hear about. So you don't hear about like violence against healthcare workers or violence against teachers or whatever. But we hear these media things about groups because sometimes it serves a purpose, right? If it leads, if it bleeds. So, what's most important for us is to get the facts around what's going on and address specifically. We're just talking about how to deal with the virus, right? How you want to contain it. You want to find it, contain it, and then make sure that there's facts and data coming out. Same thing with this. I mean, it's a sickness, it's an illness, it's an ignorance that's there. And we have to address it and find it. But there's also a level of, I think, confidence and I think data integrity that needs to be pushed back out in terms of really how safe it is at various parts of the US or where you're trying to go. And that there are things that you can do to manage these situations. But also, there is also a large increase in just awareness and diversity training, which for the most part has been very, very good and eye-opening for a lot of people. And so there is a level of sensitivity and acceptance that there is a problem that needs to be managed. So I just think some real good data of what is happening out there, not just the downside, but the upside of everything that we've been talking about will really help address that.
Thank you, Tony. Bert, Billy, if you'd like to comment?
Well, I think, I mean, gun violence is another huge issue in US. But if you also look at the Asian hate, and then the question is, hey, some Singaporeans are reluctant to go to US now, and they rather go to UK and Australia. I don't know how the numbers compare amongst US, UK, and Australia in terms of crime rates and all that. But my own experience of growing up and living in US in most places is generally a safe place to live. And places that a lot of these universities are based in are mostly a very safe places. And then if the universities happen to be in a more difficult area, and they do an excellent job of administrating and policing the area so that the school environment is kept extremely safe. So I think from a study standpoint, I don't think there's much to really be concerned about. It's just that for your own preference and easiness of assimilation, you might want to consider some of the locations or universities that have a more larger Asian student body or communities, so that it'll be easier for you to assimilate. It'll be easier for you to find the selection of the food that you can find over the weekend, and etc. And same goes to working in the U.S. Large cities in the U.S. and in both sides of the coast, whether it's East Coast or the West Coast, has a significant large Asian American communities. And then cities over the years have done a very good job of managing general crimes and all that. So I think only thing that you really are concerned about is this Asian hate. But I think this Asian hate is also coming from this misunderstanding from the pandemic. People think that it's Asians are responsible for it. So there's this perhaps this human behavior that if you're not an Asian person and you look at Asian, and then you kind of think that, oh, because of these people, we are suffering this pandemic situation. But I think over time, I think people will get beyond that. I believe the societies and the governments will help the communities to go beyond that, and then it'll be go back to a generally a good place to live. Because in my experience of living and visiting U.S., I consider it to be a pretty safe country. I mean, of course, there are certain parts of U.S. just like anywhere in the world that you wouldn't go to, and that's true whether you're in U.S. or anywhere in the world. But I think my input to this person, it would be I wouldn't be too concerned about living or working in the U.S.
Thank you, Bert. Billie, if you'd like to add anything to that.
Well, I will be quick. I think Bert and Tony both explained it very, very well. I'm definitely not the expert in this area on gun violence and not planning to convince anyone about whether this is real or not real. But I will say this: my daughter was here for an exchange for 6 months, and if it's not because of the pandemic, she would have stayed longer. So. Again, I think research is important, facts are important, get some data, understanding. Again, US is a big country, different state, different university have different pros and cons. So I would just advise the parents to do those research.
Thank you for that. And just, adding from my own experiences as well, I fully agree with what each of you has said. Be prepared, know the area that you're in. But also your own behavior as well can really help de-escalate how things go. I lived in a couple of rough areas in San Francisco. I've never had anything personally happen, but I was aware of my surroundings and I never really felt unsafe because I felt prepared. And for me, I felt like that really went a long way. And certainly I've definitely been approached by, unsavory, sort of difficult characters. And what I did was, I would de-escalate. I would say, no, thank you. And then, walk away, walk across the street. I knew these sort of techniques because my own friends would have shared the same. I've learned from my own, support group as well. So I think, really being prepared for what may happen, being prepared of your surroundings, I think really played a large part. But by and large, I've never felt, really unsafe. I really enjoyed my time living in the US, and I thought I got a lot of benefit out of it. I wanted to segue a little bit more on sort of a bit of history, about of US history, the history of hate. We have two related questions here. One is, why does it appear that the US has always seemed to be filled with hate? Whether it's hate against African Americans, non-Jewish Americans, now Asian Americans. We're really just constantly seeing this in the news. And then, secondary to that, we're really starting to see that, social media is very ubiquitous. What is the difference now? Why are we seeing such a surge of hate and a surge of hate against Asians? It's a difficult question.
Well, I mean, I'll start. It's a very nuanced question as well, and so I would say there's no right answer. No one will have the complete answer, I guess is the way to say that. What we have found and what we have seen, and again, we're based in Wisconsin, so we have an office in Sydney and a couple over in the UK, and so we sort of have a global view. But we certainly are not like experts on the US and what's happening here. This much I will say, though, is that there is money in hate in the US. And when there's money to be had, I mean, there will be people trying to take advantage of that. And it's sort of it sort of is attracting the worst side of people, right? Is trying to do this grouping, trying to put groups against each other. And that's not the history of America, and that's totally not who we are. And the vast majority, we know the beauty and the elegance of having a diverse group of people that have come together from all around the world. And so it's so sort of antithetical to who we are as a nation, that to see it so highlighted and then see these incidences sort of amped up and then actually giving cover to other ones that then occur, it's not right. It's not who we are. So we're addressing it. But the impact of social media, I think, for the most part, I mean, forget the snide comments and being invisible and things like that. I think it's been actually very helpful. I think it has pulled the globe together. We have 37,000 instructors around the world. And so we have, behavioral health nurse in Singapore working with someone in Baltimore, someone in London. And they have more in common together because of the role that they play and the people that they see. They see the same types of, schizophrenic or whatever it is, than like you or I do, and so it's been a very powerful element that we're breaking through I believe, a lot of the groups that we see ethnically or culturally, and really getting to the core of who we are and what animates us as people. What do we choose to do with our career? How do we want to make an impact in society? And so I think that's been a positive thing. And it's like this, so it's a hard one to sort of figure out. But I also, this sort of what Bert is talking about, my own personal experience and our own sort of corporate experience, we have not been involved or pulled into these incidences, a higher frequency or even a higher severity versus what we're seeing. But I mean, obviously it is happening in some of these cities, and they need to be taken care of.
Thank you, Tony. Bert, Billie?
Well, it's a very difficult question as to
Yeah.
why, why there's so much hate. So I don't think I'm qualified to, answer that question. I think, I think perhaps you gotta, understand a bit of a history, and maybe it'll give you a directional answer. Is that U.S. is a large country, and it's a country that's made of immigrants over, what is it now, 300 plus years. First the Pilgrims in the before 1700s to now, so it's like over 300 plus years. And then I think because the first immigrants to the U.S. were mostly from European countries, it started out as a kind of more of a European country, or the ethnic type of immigrants, and then later there was other people started to come in and started really form a country of an immigration. But then from a percentage of a race, the white race, it was largely the majority. But then, you started to see these numbers change, right? Because now the large Hispanics are also part of the population. Afro-Americans are like, I believe, 10 to 12% of the population. And Asian Americans are now, I believe, in mid-single digit, approaching kind of 10 kind of percentage at US at large. So as a result, I believe what used to be this dominant majority, that number in the white race has perhaps reduced. And then I don't know why that really leads to hate. It's perhaps also that it's more open to talk about it as well, because of the freedom of speech and social media and all that, the kind of expedites or the escalates all of these communications spread across. So I think it's just good to understand that historical perspective. But most importantly, I think Tony mentioned this as well, is that it's important when you live in a new country or a new neighborhood or new work or anything that's new to you, is that really build your network and your allies. And if there are resource groups, whether it's school or at work, that you can be part of, it'll be great to be part of that, because it's a way to really share your experience and learn from other people's experience in a very safe and trusted setting. And so that you can, if you have incidences, then you can share these incidences with people, and then you can decide on the appropriate steps, and rather than trying to do that on your own. And I think that's this approach is true whether you're going to the US or just moving into a different country within Asia, or just different regions, even within US, because when you run into a new environment, you'll face new things, and then you need to understand the context, and you need to really have people who've gone through the similar experiences to guide you to manage that.
Thank you, Bert. Billie, anything you'd like to add?
Well, the only thing I will add is I would say that the current stressful situation, people has been locked into their home for about a year, and all the social media of blowing up certain issue probably is not really helping the situation. That's why they're more stressful and hostile environment around. So again, I'm not the expert in this area. I don't know why. I just think that with me for the last 2 years, I would say last 1 year, there were times that I just told my husband, just switch off the TV, don't watch the news, done. You know.
Yeah. I fully agree with what all of you said. I think for me, how I've seen it is that, the issues have already, they've always been there. I think the pandemic has, really exacerbated it. People are tense all around for a variety of reasons, and sometimes they need an outlet for that. But I think that, media, social media actually, from Twitter to Facebook to even just blog posts have really started to sort of unveil all these inequalities, all these underlying issues that have always been there. And these are very difficult conversations to have and difficult, news articles to read as well, but it's a discussion that needs to be happened because it's an ongoing issue. It is tied into history. It's also tied into just, the current situation that we're in. But I think that, the media's sort of social media has really unveiled that really big issue. Just touching on a little bit more about sort of, history, we have two related questions on, the model minority. And I don't know how familiar, some of you may be in terms of this definition, but it's really Asians are considered the model minority in the US, higher socioeconomic status generally, higher education, they're, very obedient to the law. So they're called the model minority. But, it's also quite a controversial concept because it's been, also used as an excuse for, for no need for government intervention when it comes to, socioeconomic, differences and inequalities between different minorities. So there's really two questions on that. What is done to bust the myth of the model minority, which has always been used to put a wedge between other minorities in the US? And then secondary, how much of a role does class, connection, and wealth play in how Asian Americans are treated in the US? Also another difficult question, but
I mean, I can only do the first one. They're going to have to do the Asian American Network thing. But just again, I just want to reiterate, there is that. So whenever you end up being grouped in some way, like model minority. So first of all, Asian just as a minority, there's so many different layers to that term. It's so different that people need to sort of break out of these groupings like that. So even just saying model minority is sort of pejorative to everybody involved in the whole thing because there's so many nuances. But again, I mean, like Bert said earlier, and when you look at the statistics, the working poor, the percentage, just say it's 8% or whatever of Asians in America, and the working poor is like 13%, right? So you're overrepresented in the working poor. Now the key there is you're working. You're poor, but you're working versus taking welfare. And so there's just there are nuances that come to play here. It's very, I mean, my grandma came from, sort of escaped communist Russia back before World War I, and not communist, but very dictatorial regimes, and came here with nothing and grew up. So all of us, no matter how we look, we all have very similar backgrounds and very similar trauma. The one thing also to realize is everybody has a backpack of trauma that they carry, really, at the end of the day. They have a backpack of beautiful attributes and things like that, but everybody's got something. And so you were talking about earlier how social media sort of has brought up some of these other things. One thing that we've learned at CPI is that everybody has something that they can talk over traumatically and things like that, that has really sort of factored into their career choice, the way they handle relationships, their worldview, things like that. But when it comes to, this model minority, I think it's a term that is sort of too broad and can actually take us down paths that are not really helpful in moving us forward. But happy to hear from Bert and Billie on the other side of the question and even that.
Well, I can start by saying that remember the 3 hours orientation, cultural orientation that I attended. That was the first time I heard modern minority. I was like, what? What does that mean? So it is just stereotyping, I would say. I don't know. My not understanding the background, the history of it, I'll say that I would take the positive coming out of that versus the negative, right? Because they tend to look at Asian that we are well-mannered, we are polite, we are hardworking, we are educated. Yeah, I'll take that. But it doesn't mean that polite doesn't put us into a category of we don't speak up, we don't stand for our right, we don't stand for ourselves. So I don't know how to feel about this, but I don't have allergic reaction yet to modern minority, unless Bert convinced me otherwise.
No, Billie, I think you brought up a great point, and I think it's really great that it was brought up in your consultation. You know, a lot of breaking these stereotypes, these prejudices, these biases is just having the discussion about it, addressing it, bringing knowledge to it. So I'm actually really surprised and also really pleased that it did come up in your consultation. That sounds like a pretty good process.
Orientation, that's right.
Yeah, orientation. Bert, if you'd like to add.
Yeah, I'm just give you a very simple personal perspective on this. I think model minority kind of a myth exists because people in general, they love to stereotype, right? We all do, we love to stereotype. Before we understand some things, you know, with the right context and right specifics to form a really, you know, good opinion around it, before we do that, we as a human have a tendency to, we love to stereotype. So my first answer is that myth probably exists because people at large just love to stereotype. But then, so that's probably the model minority. And that's because probably, you know, there's large Asian Americans that are at a professional kind of jobs. So then, you know, because of percentage of the professionals in the workforce are probably overrepresented than the people who live in the US, and then they're viewed as, oh, you look at Asians, they're so successful, they don't cause trouble, they're successful professionally, etc. So deemed to be model minority. But then again, like we talked about before, the economic representation of the income is also not, doesn't support that stereotype. So I believe it's just a stereotype that's going on. And my personal reaction to that is that's because people love to stereotype. Is that an okay answer, Jessica?
No, I think you addressed it, and you're right. I mean, it is at its core just a stereotype, so that, you know, making sure to bring awareness to that, I think is going to be a really powerful way to combat that. You know, I wanted to segue into sort of spreading knowledge outside of the US. So we have a question from Lynn saying that, you know, for companies with a good number of overseas employees, say Singaporean employees, how do you engage them to understand the Asian hate across the US? Particularly for those living in Singapore, they don't have that experience locally. So how do we engage them so that they understand what's going on? And I think this is a great question because, you know, when the Black Lives Matter movement really started to kick off, you know, we actually started to see that support here in Singapore, which I thought was really quite powerful. You know, how do you get Singaporeans here to also understand and care about the Asian hate in the US now in this time?
You know what, that's such a great question. So, you know, we have a large, you know, number of team members based in Singapore, and many of them do global roles because, you know, we run business globally out of Singapore, and then we interact a lot with US because Dell Technologies is headquartered out of Texas, as you know. So I think that this is something that I'll give more thought as to how we can. I'll talk to my Singapore team members to understand their kind of interest and their curiosities as to what they want to really understand, and perhaps I'll do some discussions with the team so that we can help the team understand and recognize why these issues exist. I'm not personally qualified to give a complete class on that, but I think with the help of the employee resource groups and the human resources department, I think we can put together something that helps our Singapore-based employees to be more aware and educated about this issue. And it's a great question and a great suggestion.
Thank you, Bert. Tony, Billie?
Well, I would say go back to what we talk about is to, first of all, getting ourselves educated, right? So I remember in my company, we ran a lot of different trainings and different awareness program. And one of it that was extremely effective, I would say, be aware of our own bias and privilege. Sometimes we don't even know that we have bias. So until we recognize that, we acknowledge that, then only we can move forward. So again, be aware of our own bias and our own privilege. Then listen and educate ourselves. Having conversation, having discussion, that kind of open up your perspective, and you're gonna go like, there's gonna be a lot of aha moment that make you realize that, oh, I never thought about that. Oh, I didn't know that that's how that's gonna make you feel this way and stuff like that. So I would just say that companies can do a lot of that training awareness, and we ourselves should continue to educate ourselves. And bias, acknowledging bias and recognizing our own privilege, I think is the first step.
Thank you, Billie. Tony, anything to add?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I said this earlier, so bias and social categorization are scientific, very early, right out of the womb. You know, within 3 days, they're recognizing who they want to interact with and who scares them. And I've had that myself when I picked up a child and they started screaming. It's very early, and you just have to learn about it and deal with it. The other thing is like I love the tagline, you know, cultural humility. I think there's a sensibility that needs to be put into this around that we are made up of so many other dimensions than just our culture. It's off the charts. So if you find yourself sort of going down that path, it's not always going to be the most helpful, and it may suboptimize some of your relationships. So yeah, it'd be fascinating to see what Bert finds out from the team over there in Singapore.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about creating opportunities for dialogues and then sharing that within your own network. I think that there's a lot of Singaporeans here who are very sort of globally thinking very forward. They want to think globally, they want to understand current events, but where do they have that safe space to, you know, engage in dialogue on that? So I think creating opportunities, sharing those opportunities in your own networks, I think will be, you know, a really powerful tool to help residents here to get a better understanding. You know, just related to that, we do have a question on sort of HR policies and any changes that are being done because of the pandemic, because of this recent surge. Are you seeing any sort of changes within your own companies to educate staff on diversity, inclusion, equity, and then, you know, what support services are starting to be offered or considered, you know, for your employees? I mean, Billie, you brought up it sounds like your orientation is really quite thorough. Are you seeing more of that, you know, within your own company? And then Bert and Tony as well, you know, what are you seeing?
Well, I can add on to that. So again, research say that more than 40% of US-based employees experience some kind of racism and discrimination in the workplace, and not specific to Asian, that's of course. So I would say that for employer, for any company, leadership message matters. So for UPS, our own CEO has come out and took reaffirm our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that kind of provide the confidence to the employee around the world that hey, is that acknowledgement from the senior leader or the CEO of the company, and something is going to be, I think that sends a very, very strong message. So leadership coming out to condemn racist sentiment and any type of discrimination, I think that is extremely important, and we have done that. Then of course, there are a lot of initiatives right now ongoing. We appointed our DEI officer. We talk about a lot of initiative and accountability, as well as measurement to make sure that there are equal voices represented on any table. So yeah, I won't say that change of policy. I would say that intensify the activities and the messaging and the initiatives.
Thank you, Billie. Bert, Tony?
Well, from Dell Technologies' point of view, we have a kind of a moonshot goal of our 2030 goal of really getting company, reach the diversity, whether it's a racial diversity or gender diversity. And we've been working on that journey for last already couple, 2-3 years. And we have a pretty extensive program helping employees understand what really the diversity means. And this diversity is not only gender, cultural, but it could be economic diversity, how you're brought up and all of that. So there's a significant effort that we've been focused on for last already 3-4 years and moving our agenda forward and our journey forward. So, and I think, and then recently, because of the things that we've experienced in the US, I myself participated in kind of a listening sessions with Afro-American team members, as well as Hispanic team members, as well as Asian American team members that are based in the US, kind of a effort put together by employee resource groups to, as a part of the leadership in the company, really wanting to understand the personal experiences and the issues they see through their lens and their experience, which kind of helped me understand the issues a lot more deeply, so that as a leader, when I lead my global team, that I can be more effective in driving our diversity and inclusion agenda.
Thank you. Tony?
Yeah, and we're seeing an uptick. I mean, in two ways. One is certainly, being a AAPI founded company to begin with, we've been a very diverse company from the start. One of the reasons why I was hired into my role by the private equity firm that owned the company 12 years ago was because of my diverse background and the ability to lead large global teams of very diverse backgrounds to high performance. And there is actually a performance upgrade through diversity. What is diverse? Diversity, equity, and inclusion in and of itself are very loaded terms too, and they're very deep. So it's really, what are you trying to get to? But certainly the forums that you have, goal setting, knowing where you're headed, and making sure you're optically pure in terms of getting there is important. But we've always overachieved. The U.S. government does a good job of publishing Department of Labor statistics around what levels, what percentages everybody should be, ableist or age or socioeconomic, the whole thing. And I'm proud to say, I'm one of the dinosaurs, being a white male walking through the hallways there. We overachieve on all those. That being said, what we're seeing from our customers though, so we train in 17, almost 18,000 facilities every year are holding our trainings. And we have seen an uptick in how does our training integrate with the DEI initiatives that they're having as either a large hospital system or a large, education district. So we do have, we call it a crosswalk. We have developed some content that melds the two together to give it just a different, sort of more effective and relevant face to as they hold our trainings, in addition with the DEI type work that our customers are doing. So absolutely, that's been a trend.
Great, thank you. So I am, mindful that we have about 5 minutes left. So this will be the final question. So I want to ask, what roles can non-Asian allies play in combating anti-Asian hate? Final thoughts, final answers.
Okay, I can start first. I say speak up and show up. That's what we do as friend and ally. Speak up when we sense or when we see something is wrong, and show up to support when your voice is needed. No action is too small, even just by talking and discussing about it, or by participating in a forum like this.
Thank you, Billie. That's
Yeah,
powerful.
I would second that, Billy. Speak up and show up, and then also build your network of allies, whether it's resource groups or at work or school, and then share your experience so that you are better educated and understand the context better, so that you can form your opinion based on more education. Hey, I want to take just a minute, if I may. Jessica, there is a
Yeah.
question I read about the third culture Asian American kids going to the US college.
Yes.
So having lived through that experience myself, and then also having a lot of friends gone through that type of experience, my advice would be very selective on where you go, so that, as I said, different parts of the US have different kind of a support network, or the different percentage of Asian Americans living there. So be selective on where you go, because depending on where you go, your experience may be different. Prepare your kids so that they'll run into this situation that they may hold U.S. passport, but they're not really American because they haven't grew up in U.S. But they may not be accepted as someone from China or someone from Singapore or Korea, because they went to American schools, not the local schools. So they're really this third culture kids. So kind of prepare your kids for that kind of experience, and then most importantly, find the resource groups and networks, so that your kids in college can be supported through some of these difficulties. So I think that would be my quick advice.
Thank you, Bert. Tony?
Yeah, I would just say quickly about the ally side of it. They both said it very well. I think the network is very important, as well as acting up, speaking up, and making yourself available. And again, I mean, I think I hope everybody comes over. We'd love to have you part of CPI or anything, part of this great experiment that we have in the US. I mean, I think you will be shocked to learn, when you humanize your interactions, wherever you end up in the US, the depth, the welcoming aspect, the depth that we are going to welcome you and treat you with respect, and learn from each other. And the sheer fact that we all have perceptions of who we're meeting and how we got here, but all of us have been on journeys, and our families have been on journeys that are so similar. We're all humans. And I think when you look at each person, and you realize that work, there's dignity in work. And so you're working together, and you're both humans. I think that is going to just shed so many things about what we think about each other, and it's just going to enlighten and animate such a much better belonging in terms of reaching whatever goals you want to have, both as a person, both as a professional. So I want to thank you guys. I think Bert and Billie, you've been amazing. Reach everybody over there. So thank you for allowing CPI to share a little bit of our story, and myself personally.
No, thank you. And my 2 cents to that as well, just to add on for those young students, I would say reach out to your support. Join the student groups. They're a mix of both locals and foreign students who are participating. For me, that's sort of how I survived my university years, even though I am American. But that group brought such a great, diverse gathering of just people, of cultures, of experiences. And I thought that was a really great way to sort of have that support network on hand. And then, Billie, I'm going to put that on my link down, show up and speak up, I think is powerful. These injustices, these sort of tensions, they only continue because nobody speaks up. And I think that's really important to do that moving forward. So I'm really thankful. I just wanted to make one last point. We do want to encourage our business leaders to support the AAPI Business Leaders Pledge. So there's a pledge going on called Stand with Asian Americans to fight violence against Asians and to stop hate, to recognize the intersectionality of racial and gender-based hate, to work for justice, and to end discrimination and violence against the Asian community and all marginalized communities that are put into practice. So AmCham in a social media post, we will be referencing to that. So if you do see it, I really hope that you'll also take that pledge, that you'll also encourage those in your network to take the pledge. All of this starts with creating dialogue, about creating empathy and awareness. And I think, thank you so much to Bert, Billie, and Tony. I think you did a really great job in bringing that awareness. And I look forward to seeing more and increased dialogues on these sort of tough issues, these tough questions, because we need to have them. We need to spread that awareness and empathy. So thank you. I know Billie and Tony, you're in the US right now, so it's quite late. So I hope you do get a good night's rest. And then Bert, I hope you have a great rest of the day. And to our attendees, thank you so much for attending this session.